Almost got it wrong.
Come on, Matt. By the third, I hope you get this right.
Maybe. This is where we look at the last fortnight in economics, climate change, and a heap of other issues. And we basically summarise it on this lovely Friday afternoon and have a chat to you about what's happening. Today I've got last fortnight, you might have remembered we had Greg. Today I've got Richard.
Right.
And later we're going to be talking to Polly.
Excellent.
About climate change.
Is that still happening?
I believe it's still happening.
I thought we fixed that.
Climate change? Well, maybe.
We had an election or something and we fixed it.
We had the climate election.
Yeah. Oh, well, let's see.
We'll see. So we're going to talk about a few issues today, but we might start with the big issue, the big economic issue anyway, and that's the RBA interest rates and inflation.
Yeah, well, I guess let's start with the I told you so. I think, wasn't there data released this week that said, Matt and Richard and the Australian Institute, you were right. You were right about everything.
Well, I'm not sure the RBA said that, but they released data that said that.
Wow, what did the data say, Matt? Well, let's go back a step. We've been arguing for over a year now that profits are a major form of what's driving inflation in Australia. That firms are increasing prices much faster than their wages bills going up, much faster than their energy bills going up. And if you increase your price more than your costs went up, your profits would go up.
Basic accounting.
You'd think so.
Yeah. And the RBA thought this was?
Well, I think it was flawed.
Wrong.
Silly?
Silly?
Oh, no, that was the Fin Review.
Fin Review said it was silly.
Yeah.
I think it was Treasury that said it was flawed.
Treasury was flawed. So for a year we've been literally looking at the numbers and saying, look, it looks to us like the data says that it's profits that are driving inflation, not wages. And this was a controversial thing to say until a couple of weeks ago, the well-known pinko lefties at the OECD first came out.
Run by Matthias Cormann, the finance minister under Abbott.
West Australian Liberal finance minister. So the OECD a couple of weeks ago came out and, maybe didn't say, gee, the Australian Institute's completely right, but they did actually release very similar data to ours using the same method, found the same conclusion. But that was when the OECD said, well, right, Matt, what did the RBA say?
Well, the RBA basically came out and decomposed inflation. So they broke it up into what was caused by the supply side, which is mostly around profits and things like that, and how much was caused by the demand side, wages. And they found that 3/4 of the inflation, 3/4, was caused by the supply side.
Wow. That's interesting because I think at some point we said that 69% of the inflation that we needed to worry about was caused by profit.
They're pretty close.
They sound very similar, don't they?
They do sound very similar.
Yeah. Now, apart from enjoying being right, which, let's face it, I think we are.
I think everybody enjoys that.
I think so. This is really important because the Reserve Bank has been saying that it's worried about inflation, and that in order to control inflation, the Reserve Bank has been pulling on the interest rate brakes, so increasing the amount of money people spend on their home loan repayments in particular.
Smashing households' budgets.
By design, the point of jacking up the interest rates is to make people spend hundreds of dollars a week more on their mortgage repayments, because if they're spending hundreds of dollars a week more on their mortgage repayments, they're not spending that on food and clothing and everything else. So the Reserve Bank has been worried about inflation. It's been thinking that consumer spending, the demand side, is causing the inflation. So by increasing interest rates, they thought, hang on, this is how we'll fix inflation. And at the same time, they've been out there saying, now workers, don't you go...
Yeah, don't get a higher wage, you'll push up inflation.
If you get higher wages, you'll cause inflation. The Reserve Bank, even though they've released this data this week, hasn't come out and said, hey, CEOs, you're causing this inflation, stop lifting your prices so much more than your costs are going up. So the significance of this debate about is it profits that are driving it or is it wages, is that if it's profits, the solutions are quite different. So Matt, if it's profits, what can we do?
Well, rather than smashing households, you should probably introduce things like price caps, super profits taxes, Basically, competition policy. Try and break up big firms, make them more competitive so they can't put up their prices and increase their profits.
Hang on, don't economists tend to think that, firms making big profits are a sign of market failure?
Yep.
And if firms are making big profits, we should have better competition laws?
Yep, exactly right.
So it's hardly radical stuff.
No, it's textbook economics.
So why are we blaming the workers then?
Well, because way back in the past, there was
The
some
old
inflation back in the 70s that might have been pushed a bit by wages.
Right.
And so really, Philip Lowe and the Reserve Bank as a general is just stuck in the 70s. They haven't updated their understanding, and he's just absolutely convinced, regardless of what the data says, that it must be wages and that wage increases are coming and that we need to worry about wages when in fact it's profits, and higher interest rates are not the solution.
Well, Matt, I think that some workers are, let's be honest, getting away with it at the moment.
Some workers?
I think some workers have really been exploiting
Maybe
this
we
crisis.
need to put a sign over these workers. Who are they, Richard?
Well, I was going to ask you, who are the group of workers that have really been milking this crisis for all they can and getting wage rises that are way above even the rate of inflation?
Yeah, well, in the last fortnight, CEO pay up 15%. So inflation 7%. CEO pay more than twice that, 15%.
Oh, CEOs, what have you been doing? So hang on, let me get this right, Matt. The group of workers who are responsible for the price setting that's causing the inflation, because they're literally in charge of picking the price for airfares, picking the price of the groceries we buy, that the CEOs who are ultimately responsible for the prices charged by companies have decided that maybe their wages should go up even faster.
But you don't understand, Richard. You don't understand. Companies are making huge profits at the moment. These CEOs are doing a great job. They need to be rewarded for these huge profits.
Pay rise.
They deserve the pay rise because they're pushing prices up because they're making big profits.
So the prices that they're not in charge of and the profits that aren't causing inflation justify the high wages they are getting.
Exactly right.
Oh, wow. We need a flow chart or something.
We do.
I'm getting confused. What else has been going on, Matt?
Well, on that kind of vein of interest rates going up, economies slowing down, New Zealand, just across the ditch, went into a technical recession. What's a technical recession?
Technical recession. All right. So economists reckon the economy goes into recession when you have 2 quarters of negative growth of GDP. So let me just go through each
Negative
of those
growth.
parts. Negative growth. Well, let's stick with 2 quarters. So a quarter is 3 months. 2 quarters,
6 months.
6 months, otherwise known as half a year. But if we said half a year, that'd sound too simple. So 2 quarters of negative growth. So what do we mean by negative growth? We mean decline. So
Economy's shrinking.
Economy shrinks for 6 months. How do we measure the size of the economy? Through GDP, gross domestic product. So if gross domestic product gets smaller for 2 quarters in a row, and the ABS calculates GDP quarterly, if GDP gets smaller 2 quarters in a row, we say that's a recession.
Yep.
Now, the technical recession comes from the fact that economists have pretty much always defined a recession as 2 quarters of negative growth, but a lot of times people feel like we're having a recession, even though the data says we're not having a recession. So now when you hear people say we're having a technical recession, they mean we're having a recession as defined by economists, whereas sometimes people will say the economy's in recession, even though the data perhaps doesn't bear
And it's
that
not all countries. I mean, in the US, they have a board basically that looks at the data and declares recession.
The Recession Committee.
Yeah, Recession Committee, that's right. And, I mean, they also take into account important things like unemployment. If unemployment's shooting up, then people sure are really going to start feeling the pain.
You mean the way that we do things in Australia isn't identical to what happens in every other country?
No. But in New Zealand, they do use the technical recession definition, so they've fallen into recession. And why have they fallen into recession, Richard? Well, their central bank been pumping up interest rates.
Yeah, because we've got the Reserve Bank of Australia, the New Zealand Central Bank, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand did what we've been doing. It's been lifting interest rates really fast. It's imposed a lot of pain on households, and those households in turn have gone off and not spent much money on the rest of their life because they're busy spending so much of it on their mortgage. And as a consequence, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has succeeded in slowing down the economy. And this is because the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is so worried about inflation that it's willing to actually cause unemployment.
Yeah, exactly right. And so now they've gone, and we need to remember interest rates are really good at creating recessions. The last big recession we had in the 1990s, most of you won't remember that, way back. What was that caused by?
Interest rates. The recession we had to have was
the-
caused by the Reserve Bank
Yep.
jacking up interest rates. Now, Matt, I could talk interest rates all day, but I think we've got a special guest.
Yeah, we've got a special guest
Got a
tonight.
special guest on the line.
Excellent. Who is this?
Well, Polly Hemming, the director of the Australian Institute Centre for Climate and Energy, is going to zoom in from another part of the office. Polly, are you there?
Yes, Richard, here I'm reporting live.
Can you hear? Can you hear?
Now, Polly, we've just been talking about all things interest rates, but of course, monetary policy and the fact that our central bank, the statutory body responsible for managing a big part of our economy, may well be trying to cause a recession. There are other problems in the world, including climate change, which governments are responsible for fixing. How's our government going at fixing that climate change thing?
How's it tracking? Actually, can I just add that you both sound so gleeful when you're talking about interest rates and causing recession, but the grin on your face, it's like you can't contain it.
Well, and to those who've taken offence, I apologise, Polly. If you yourself have taken offence, I apologise. I can only cope with either bemusement or white hot rage.
Just the idiocy of the RBA. You either have to laugh or cry.
Yeah.
And
So-
Richard and I would prefer to mock them than cry.
So you're right, Polly, but I don't know that broadcasting my real feelings for an hour about the fact that an arm of government is trying to increase the number of unemployed people in Australia.
And by the way, the Deputy Governor came out and said
All right, stop.
they want to
You've invited
increase...
me to talk about climate. That's
Yep.
enough.
Oh, hang on.
Yeah.
You
You've got us going now.
Yeah, well, you asked us to clarify our feels.
No, I
Well, we
didn't.
have.
I didn't. I just was pointing out. It's really nice to see you both smiling. So yes, well, what's happening in climate? Actually, I was going to use this platform, actually this invitation to host what I want to call the Pulse report, because
Bolt.
I don't know if people saw, but I was on the drum earlier this week talking about gas and how little gas brings to the Australian economy and how few jobs there are and how little tax the gas industry pays, and didn't mention how heavily subsidised the gas industry is. But Andrew Bolt and Barnaby Joyce have taken issue with what I was saying. Yeah.
Oh, the big minds, the big guns have come out. What have they
Yeah.
had to say?
So hence the Pult report, and this is live, so I don't think we can play the footage. But basically, I mean, actually, it's a compliment because I was platformed alongside Greta Thunberg by Mr. Bolt, who was railing against something she said. So, to be ridiculed by two people I respect probably least in the world alongside Greta Thunberg actually made my day. So anyway, Andrew Bolt got quite cross and said that, I'm an idiot, but he didn't use those words, that's the take-home message. He says, actually, gas companies will pay more than $18 billion to our governments this year. He said that the gas industry is making windfall profits, so shareholders are actually benefiting significantly from the gas industry. We wouldn't have had a surplus in the budget without Australia's gas and coal industry, and we wouldn't have money for pensions, schools or hospitals. And just threw in at the end, of course, there's no jobs in renewables and all the profits go offshore because they're foreign companies. So I don't know, I've got some thoughts about this, but you're both economists. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, am I allowed to be bemused or do I have to be angry? Because let me start with bemused. Look, I mean, the idea that the Australian economy is kind of built on the backbone of the gas industry or even the fossil fuel industry is simply absurd. And a lot of Australians believe this, and that's because Australians are stupid. It's because they've been lied to their whole lives.
I mean, the mining industry has a great PR team that works very well.
Indeed. I mean, argue its most productive workers are its PR team because, boy, they take a little bit of nonsense and turn it into enormous truth. But let's just start with the economics of this stuff. Most countries don't export oil. Most countries don't export gas. Most countries don't export coal. And you know what? They're fine. Like, it's incredibly Australian insecurity that if we didn't export some raw materials, what would we do?
Yeah.
This is a question that doesn't plague nearly any other country in the world. So this whole backbone idea is a bit nonsensical, but as you say, Polly, like, you know, they throw numbers around, they throw billions around, and, you know, let's face it, you know, if I owed Matt $1 billion, well...
Ouch.
I think... I'm not going to give it to you, Matt. Let's face it. I'm never going to see $1 billion in my life. But in the national accounts, in the Commonwealth budget, $1 billion, and only an economist can say this, it's rounding error. Yeah. It's just absolutely rounding error. So, yeah, this idea that the gas industry spent $18 billion, contributed $18 billion in taxes and royalties to Australian governments, plural, he said plural, so state and federal.
And that's not just tax.
No, that's
all the payments.
That's all the payments. You know, to put that into some context, last year the Commonwealth government alone spent $600 billion. So yeah, Polly, I think point one from me is, you know, politicians and shock jocks throwing big numbers around like to conceal the context of those big numbers.
Well, that's kind of what I figured with that figure. Okay, even if it is $18 billion, and that's a figure from APIA, actually. We looked at it, and maybe we can put this up and off the charts, but it's closer to, I think, about $13 billion that they paid to governments last year. The reason why they paid anywhere close to that amount is because they are making such enormous profits. The year before, if you take at face value what APIA is saying that the gas industry paid to governments, it was $4.84 billion the previous year. So I mean, we know the researchers showed that a lot of gas companies don't even pay corporate tax, and the royalties are low. So if one year they're paying $4.84 billion, the next year they're paying, say, around $13 billion. They're doing that because they're making so much money. Is that right?
Absolutely. And Matt, do we know anything about the size of the windfall profits that the gas industry made last year?
They're enormous. Well, I mean, as Barnaby and Andrew said, they're paying huge dividends out to the owners of these gas companies. But the windfall, I think, was around $40 billion.
Yeah, and what a windfall profit means is a profit that's over and above the profit that you were going to otherwise generate. So these were already quite profitable companies, and then for them, as luck would have it, Vladimir Putin invades Ukraine. Yep. For them, as luck would have it, world energy prices go through the roof. For them, as luck would have it, they didn't pay huge wage rises to their workers.
Not at all.
So the price that they could sell our coal, our gas, our oil for, the price went through the roof. Their costs didn't change much. So they made an estimated $40 billion in windfall profits. And yes, they are paying more company tax this year because of that. But the reality is it's still a very, very small portion of total Commonwealth revenue. The idea that without the $4 billion the year before or the $18 billion this year, we couldn't afford to have nice things is simply absurd.
Yeah, 2 points on that. The first is the $13 billion extra that they got in revenue. Sounds like a lot. We also took in $13 billion in tobacco excise that same year.
So Australia is built on the back of the smokers.
Yeah, and obviously we don't want people to quit because we wouldn't have any funding for schools and education if everybody quit smoking and we didn't have tobacco.
That's another contradiction. So then Andrew or Barnaby went on to say we wouldn't have a surplus without gas or coal, but then said we wouldn't have money for pension, schools and hospitals. So which is it?
They're saving it and spending it at the same time.
Yeah, the surplus was about this much, and you could say that about any industry that's paying any tax, like fortified wine. pays
Yeah.
taxes. It was fortified wine that got us back into the black.
Well, I'd like to think us port
saving
drinkers.
money, or is it the gas industry spending money on? Are we able to spend money on schools and hospitals and all these lovely things because of those industries?
Yeah, I mean, so economists call that double counting. There's Barnaby and Andrew Bolt, two of the most well-respected economic analysts in the country, I should say, doing a bit of double counting, simultaneously saying it's the revenue from the gas industry what gave us the surplus.
Yep.
But that same revenue apparently funded the spending on schools and hospitals. I mean, how absurd. But yeah, I mean, again, keep in mind that the Commonwealth spent around $600 billion last year. The AUKUS submarines are going to cost $300 billion. The Stage 3 tax cuts, $250 billion. The idea that a little bit of tax from the gas industry, is
propping up the budget.
Up the budget, keeping the economy strong. I mean, it's great PR. I mean, well played, gas industry. I think maybe they spend a fortune on former politicians and former journalists, and maybe they spend a lot of that.
Current politicians like Barnaby going on there, and
well, there's certainly plenty of donations flowing that way. But yeah, so Polly, to answer your question, no, it's absolute double counting. It's absolutely absurd.
And also, the gas industry doesn't pay a huge amount of tax. They pay out a lot in dividends. Maybe that's helping Australians, which was one of the points you said that Andrew and Barnaby were making. It's interesting to note that the RBA very recently was worried. Somebody pointed out, look, all of these payouts of dividends might be causing inflation. All this money flowing out into the hands of Australians' pockets who own the shares. And they said, no, don't worry.
Fear not.
Fear not, don't worry. The gas industry is almost entirely foreign owned.
All the dividends are going overseas.
And they're not going to cause any inflation in Australia. So you don't need to worry about it.
Well, that's the other contradiction. These are public resources. Like, I don't like it, but it's our gas. I'd rather it stayed in the ground, but it's our gas. Shouldn't the money be the dividends be coming to Australians, not private shareholders, regardless of whether they're based in Australia or elsewhere?
Look, Polly, I hate to tell you, economists don't do should. Wouldn't be for us to say what we should do, but it is a wonderfully important democratic question. And let's just say people in Norway came up with a democratic answer, which was that the overwhelming proportion of the revenues from Norwegian oil should flow into the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Saudi Arabia is not much of a democracy, but the Saudis think that the overwhelming amount of revenue that comes from the high oil prices should flow back to Saudi Arabia. Whereas our funny little democracy here in Australia, we think, nah, that's crazy.
Give it away overseas.
We've got a better idea. Well, no, Matt, that's not generous enough. Let's be clear. We should subsidise foreign companies. We should throw money at them to come here.
Because otherwise they wouldn't.
Otherwise they might not want to play with us, and we're so insecure we would need our friends. So step one, we subsidise. Step two, we often don't even charge royalties. Like around half the gas in Australia doesn't pay any royalties. So step one, subsidise. Step two, no royalties. Step three, we create a petroleum resource rent tax, which doesn't collect much tax.
Almost none.
And then there's a little bit of tax paid by the company tax. So you're right, Polly, as a citizen, I think we should. But our democracy is so highly functioning that clearly everybody watching today has decided it's much better to export those dividends alongside all the gas we're exporting rather than do what those crazy Norwegians or those crazy Saudis do.
And Qatar.
Or those Qataris, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of all I wanted to talk about today. I believe there's a climate crisis. I'm sure there's been some other things happening in the news, but I really wanted this opportunity just to address or have a right of reply to the Bolt report. And check it out, everyone. Like, it's worth watching.
I think we might take a closer look at the Bolt report in the coming days. But Polly, just before you go, we were just talking about subsidies. Isn't there a nice big juicy new subsidy that this government recently introduced for the oil and gas industry up in the Northern Territory?
Yeah, actually, and this is a direct subsidy. So the Australian government, the number kind of has been bandied around 1.5 to 1.9 billion dollars, but they gave that money directly to a gas export hub in the Northern Territory. And bearing in mind, so the 1.9 billion figure came from the budget papers last year. The Australian government has a fund called the Powering the Regions Fund, which is designed to basically decarbonise our industry, and that's $1.9 billion. That's essentially wiped out in one fell swoop with $1.9 billion to this middle arm precinct in the NT. And that we know, according to FOIs and now government documents, that that is literally a gas export hub. And it was described as this whole precinct, Middle Arm precinct, was described as critical to making sure that the Beetaloo, the fracking the Beetaloo Basin in the Northern Territory, the Middle Arm hub is critical to making sure that the Beetaloo is viable in terms of a business case.
Wow. Well, I'm confused, Polly, because well, we've got you here. If you've got a minute, isn't it true that Australia has committed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies? Isn't it true that Australia is trying to host a climate conference, the COP, with the Pacific Island nations as our partner, on the basis that working with the Pacific, we want to tackle climate change? I'm confused. Why on earth would we be spending $1.5 billion subsidising a new gas export terminal when we're so keen to make friends with the Pacific so we can jointly tackle climate change together?
That's an excellent question, Richard.
You can come back on this show.
I'm hoping you can answer that. Yeah, it's bizarre. I don't know if there has been an explicit commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Certainly, I know Josh Burns, member for Macnamara, mentioned that at an event that I attended with him. But certainly the rhetoric gives you that impression. You know, we're back on the international stage. We've got a 43% by 2030 target. We're going to be net zero. We're going to be a renewable energy superpower. Yet it doesn't seem like fossil fuel subsidies have decreased at all. We've recently approved a new coal mine. We still have over 100 new gas and coal projects in development. I think probably Pacific communities would like an answer to the question that you've just asked me too.
Yeah. Excellent. All right, Polly. Well, thanks for joining us today. And we'll talk to you soon about, we'll try and, next time we speak, hopefully I'll have an answer to why we're so much more generous to the fossil fuel industry than we are to our Pacific neighbours.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Polly. Well, I think we're almost out of time.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us today. We're back here in a fortnight's time to talk about the big issues affecting the economy in Australia. And of course, nothing affects the economy in the long run more than the climate. But if you're interested in our stuff, please follow us on social media, check out our website. We regularly run webinars and other events. And thanks. And please, if you've got questions, you've got things you'd like us to talk about next time, let us know.
Thanks for